going to start with a bit of an introduction to Feed the Need in Durham and who we are. Feed the Need in Durham started about 15 years ago as a collaboration of multiple food security organizations in our community. And for those of you not familiar, Durham region is the east side of the Greater Toronto area. So we butt operate against Toronto. We're very much in many ways a commuter community for the City of Toronto. But not completely. We do have a lot of our own industry. Oshawa, Ontario is headquarters to General Motors Canada. It's based there, and we have a history of being an auto manufacturing community. Obviously that's changed a lot over the last 25, 30 years. We're now very much a healthcare and a university community. We have a, I say new, but the university's actually now been around for almost 20 years. In Durham, it was a newly established, with the newest university in Ontario, Ontario Tech University, which I actually did my graduate work at. So we're a growing and burgeoning community. I was born and raised in the community, so it's my home. I did leave for school, came back. So the work we're doing at Feed the Need is very much about bringing our community together around food security. We started off simply as a food hub. Lots of food was available to our community, and some groups were able to gather a lot of food but weren't necessarily serving as many people as other groups who couldn't gather as much food. So Feed the Need came into being to provide equitable access to food across our network of 70 organizations and programs. So we collect large volumes of food and distribute it across that network based on an equitable distribution model. We use a system called Link to Feed. Feed Ontario adopted that. That's our provincial association about a decade ago. Link to Feed is a network database. I think you mentioned you have housing one, similar in Newfoundland. This is basically for food banks. This is what we actually track our hunger count in. So in Ontario, the hunger count completely comes out of the Link to Feed system. We're able to report locally as well as provincially on that, and that's what we use. It gathers client information and allows for us to understand who is using food banks and how often and when they're doing that. We use that and very much encourage it as a way for us to understand where the needs are across our community and what they're being driven. We don't dictate to our members any real rules other than you have to follow, we have ethical food banking standards which actually come from Food Banks Canada. And other than that, we don't really dictate any rules. We have members who allow access and provide service once a month. We have members who never turn anyone away. We don't really dictate any of that. We encourage a model of abundance where we say to our members, you say yes to people and we will make sure the food is on your shelves. We don't want anyone turned away in our network, and if an organization can't provide service because they're just smaller, we've got many small, especially faith-based organizations, we say to them, you know, we have a network. If you can't serve them because you don't have the volunteers that day, you're not open that day, you don't have the food on your shelf, you've got a network of 70 providers that you can reach out to. You can reach out to us and we will make sure people get the food they need when they need it. We don't turn anyone away. And that really comes from I built that model. My previous organization did a lot of work on settlement services with newcomers, and we built welcome centers in our community, which are a no wrong door model of service, and we've tried to apply that to our model of food banking as well. So that's a bit about Feed the Need. And like you, we've seen the growth. I just did the report. We see about 135,000 visits a year to our network. We're distributing about 2.5 to 3 million pounds of food to that group. And that's increased by about 50 to 60%, depending on which metric we're looking at, in the last year and a half or so. So we're experiencing the growth just like everyone else is. Actually, going through your presentation earlier, I felt solidarity. It's all the exact same. We're dealing with the exact same things. We've got issues with rural and transportation access. We've got issues with resources and understanding where they need to be. We've got issues with food supply. We've got all of those same issues in Ontario that you have here. So we're dealing with the same types of things. That will lead a bit into my conversation. So I'm gonna get you to press the top button. There we go. So from all of this, how did I arrive at basic income? So my work for the first decade of my career was at an organization called the European Development Council of Durham. It's a social planning organization. I very much did a lot of anti-poverty work there. I did research on poverty. I come from a background in anthropology, so I was very much informed by the work of Dr. Paul Farmer, who actually unfortunately passed away last year. And he was an anthropologist physician who did a lot of work in Africa and Haiti, and he talks a lot about structural violence and criminal social systems. And my graduate degree is actually in criminology, where I studied criminal social systems. I looked at policy in Ontario as a form of structural violence, especially as it pertains to social assistance policy. And what I mean by that is that this is policy that puts people at risk. It is policy that is pejorative in many ways, and it puts people at risk of ill health. It puts people at risk of food insecurity. It puts people at risk of housing instability and homelessness. And it puts people at risk of other forms of violence, especially domestic violence, and that's especially true for racialized and BIPOC communities. It's especially true for First Nations communities, and it's especially true for women and especially single mothers and parents. So when we looked at this work, and I looked at it in my community of Durham, and I did the research there, and I did the research in a neighboring community of Northumberland County, and it was similar things. We saw people struggling day to day in a form, what I would consider a form of violence being enacted upon them by the policies under which they were forced to try and interact with just to survive. So I really did this work around structural violence and looking at policy and the way we design policies and what they actually do to people on the ground. And the intentions behind them are often to find a common ground to appease people who are critics, when they're not often designed actually for the needs of people who we're trying to serve and support. We see that in our own work of food banking, right? When we put restrictions on how we access, we're actually defining policy for entire other organizations. We're defining access points when we put too many restrictions on what we do. We need accountability, but accountability is different than restriction. And when we look at the ways that we design our policies, we really are creating systems that are pejorative in many ways. They're about creating accountabilities where we think we need to create accountabilities. They're about making people answer for the support we give them in ways that we wouldn't necessarily want to answer ourselves, right? And that's really what my graduate work and the work I did at CDCD, Community Development Council, was on. Interestingly, though, there were two paths converging. One of the first projects I did when I started at the CDCD as a social researcher was looking at a Durham Food Policy Council. And we have a food charter that still stands today in Durham Region, where we really looked at how do we build a healthy, sustainable food system. The language has changed over the years. We're now talking about food sovereignty as a community. Durham Region is not, and this is bigger than just food security. The way we talk about it, it's about community food security. Durham Region is also one of the strongest agricultural communities in Ontario. It has yes, it has urban centres like Oshawa and the Greater Toronto Area component, but it's got large tracts of rural and agricultural land, and it's some of the largest. It's one of the largest apple producers. A colleague of mine, runs Algoma Orchards, which is one of the largest apple producers in Ontario. They own orchards all over the community. In addition, we have other types of large industries, including in the dairy and egg and other industries. Large greenhouses as well. So it's an agricultural community. We've got a lot of food and we've got an abundance of food in our community, but we've also got significant food insecurity. So the convergence of these two things really started me saying, okay, what do we need to do to think about what's next? And the side of structural violence and looking at our systems really brought me to the income conversation that Dr. Tarasek was talking about. That income component of the equation towards food insecurity is definitely something that basic income can address. But when you're looking, it's also about creating a system that works for more than just those who are living in absolute poverty. And that's where I think basic income really has something interesting to tell us outside of other types of social assistance and other types of policy reform, is it can really help us understand the bigger picture and address bigger issues. And it can lay the foundation for us as food charities to talk about community food security, not just individual household food insecurity. And I'll get into that a bit. So I'm going to start, though, take a quick step back to make sure we're on the same page around basic income and what it means in Canada. And I say that because my work at BICN, I got into the work at BICN in 2018. I reached out and started working with them to help build that organization. Basic Income Canada Network is the national basic income organization. They're actually the only national incorporated not-for-profit on basic income. The other groups are there, but they're not actually formal organizations. They're very much programs associated with other things. And very shortly after getting involved with BICN, I got involved with UBI Works. Well, and their founder of UBI Works, my friend Floyd Marinescu, He got involved at the cancellation of the Ontario Basic Income pilot. He convened a group of CEOs called CEOs for Basic Income. And actually this is something that is being researched now. These are business leaders he's a business owner, who gathered together to say to argue against the cancellation of the Ontario pilot project by the Ford government. It's one of the first things they did, even though they promised not to cancel the pilot. They promised to let the pilot run so that we could at least have the data set. They canceled it fairly quickly after they got started and created all kinds of issues for people who were in the pilot communities in our province. My friend Floyd got a group of us together and we started an organization called UBI Works. UBI Works is very much an advocacy and marketing organization that really puts out very strong on social media and online content. There's a lot of surveying and work to really build the movement electronically across the country. BICN is very much a policy-oriented organization that builds conversations around basic income. And they both sort of work together along with other major partners, the Basic Income Canada Youth Network and Coalition Canada, which actually has some strong representation in Atlantic Canada. But when we want to understand basic income, these are the definitions we are talking about. It really is just it's an unconditional cash transfer from the government to individuals to enable everyone to meet their basic needs, participate, and live with dignity regardless of work status. The unconditional part is that it should be available to anyone at the time that they need it. And we have programs that exist like this, right? The Canada Child Benefit is dictated through when we file our income taxes, and it's determined based on your need from there, but it's an automatic thing. There's no cumbersome application process, there's no ongoing reporting other than filing your taxes. If your income changes year to year, your benefits can change. So there's programs already in Canada that exist like this. So that it's unconditional because it's not tied to you having any other than your need, at least in the Canadian context. There is this idea of a universal basic income. This is very much talked about globally. Some of the leading global advocates of basic income, Guy Standing in the UK, who was one of the co-founders of Basic Income Earth Network, is very much a supporter of a universal basic income. Andrew Yang in the US during his presidential campaign was very much a supporter of a universal basic income. This is a basic income that is paid to all qualified residents of a community. Qualified usually means resident status of some kind, citizenship or resident status. And it's regardless of income. Everybody receives a universal basic income. Everyone receives the same amount. They're often smaller payments. They can gradually increase depending on how they're funded and structured. Some of them are funded, like the Alaska dividend, by resource wealth, right? The Alaska dividend is paid to residents of Alaska based on their oil resources. You have the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway, who does something very similar. We have these funds that are based on resource wealth that are paid out. The other model is that they're simply government transfers to everybody. They can be much more expensive. Their portion of it is taxed back because they are taxable in these models. At least in the most models, they're taxable. So if you have a higher income, you might receive the benefit, but it applies to your overall income for the year, and you get taxed based on it. They are much more expensive. One paper I refer to in this is BICN's policy options. If you're interested in looking at an analysis of what a basic income could look like in Canada, BICN did 3 models of a basic income. One of them was based on a UBI model. They all started with the point of individuals being paid $22,000 a year. At the time, it was just around the low income measure for Canada. Couples would receive about $31,000 total as a family, or as couple units. So you would receive a little bit less if you were in a household. It is paid to individuals though, no matter what. It's always paid to the individual. So even if you're in a household, the basic income is paid to individuals, not to the household. That's really important when you're dealing, especially in instances of domestic violence or other types of. You want to make sure that benefit is not tied to another person in the household that has to, right? So that's really important that it's paid to individuals. UBI, but a UBI is much more expensive. To start, the analysis from BICN said it would cost about $637 billion annually. It would drop year over year as it's taxed back, but it's an extremely expensive model of basic income. For obvious reasons, you're paying 24 million Canadians $22,000 a year and then taxing it back, right? So it can be a really expensive model. Although it was modeled in BICN's policy options, it's not a recommended model. In Canada, we very much talk about a guaranteed livable income. If you're familiar with Evelyn Forget's work, I have her book here, which I can show you if you want. Evelyn Forget is the leading advocate on this, academic advocate on this. And we very much talk, this is what Canada talks about. To the point where we're often told by international basic income advocates that we're not talking about basic income, right? Because they don't view this as a basic income. But in Canada, it makes sense. It makes sense because of the way our social services are set up. It makes sense because of how we've built our welfare state. And it's really just a way of making sure that there is an income based on financial need for everyone in Canada. This is the difference between a guaranteed livable income and other social assistance programs. Is it's available to everybody as they need it, right? And it's and you can monitor it and manage it through things like the tax system versus through provincial social assistance systems or even federal systems. It could be managed many ways, the way many other tax credits and tax programs are managed, and tax transfer programs are managed in Canada. It's available when people need it based on their income, right? So it is targeted to people with lower incomes. So it is, depending on the model and depending on the cutoffs, there is a clawback rate. BICN's model claws back at about 40%. So as you earn other money, you're clawed back a little bit, and to the point eventually, I think in the BICN model, in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, it was clawed back at 15%. So it was a $17,000 benefit basically. You would, once you hit an income of $34,000 a year, you would no longer receive any of the benefit. But up to $34,000 a year of other income, you're receiving a top up on your income, right? And that's the important thing about our guaranteed livable income. It interacts with other forms of income. It can interact with other forms of assistance income. If it's a federal benefit, it could interact with other forms of provincial social assistance, or it can interact with old age security. Two other models in BICN's policy options. One of them was only available to adults up to the age of 64, leaving all existing seniors programs in place. The other modeling was interacted and replaced some of those seniors programs and included people above the age of 64. So there's two different models. Obviously that model will cost a little bit more, about 50 billion more, because you're including a lot more adults in the program. But again, one of the things you have to, when you look at these numbers, you have to understand that part of the policy options also looked at what could be replaced, right? So the costing includes revenue sources. What could you replace if you had a federal basic income, right? What types of programs would you not need to spend on income transfers on, right? You still might want to spend the money in other areas, but what would you not spend on income transfer programs or tax credits, okay? So those are the two sort of overall views of basic income. In Canada, we're very much talking about a guaranteed livable income. Groups like UBI Works and others really ultimately do like the idea of a universal basic income model. UBI Works is continuing to do work on things like our Commonwealth, and are there opportunities for things like resource transfers in Canada? Very much philosophical work and theoretical work at this point. But even UBI Works has said that the next phase of our development is a guaranteed livable income to address the most extreme poverty and to create security for Canadians at all multiple income levels, not just the lowest income levels. That's another piece I will say about basic income, and I think I can start talking about it. It's not just about, basic income is not just a poverty reduction tool. And I'm a big advocate for this, and in my roles at BICN and UBI Works, I very much constantly push this. Not only to audiences like yours, but also to audiences of basic income supporters. We will not get the basic income that we actually want without it being just a tweak of social assistance if we only view it as a poverty reduction tool. It needs to be viewed as an income security tool for all Canadians. And thinking to some of the stuff that Dr. Tarasek just showed us, right? Where people are food insecure at multiple income levels. But we're only serving in our networks those who are absolutely desperate and reaching out. There are many other people at different income levels with different sources of income that are not accessing programs like the ones we do. A basic income designed properly could support them as well. It creates stability and it creates income and income security for people at all levels of the income spectrum, up to a certain point. Obviously, there is a cutoff, depending on your clawback rate, but it creates security for those. If you look at the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, individuals would still receive some form of basic income. It wouldn't be the whole amount, while earning up to $34,000 a year. That could supplement, so what's it actually doing is supplementing their income. They're able to earn money in other ways, and it's actually improving their economic conditions and lives. And these are not necessarily individuals who are using food banks, right? As we know, people are more and more people who are employed or facing food insecurity. And they are actually trickling to food banks. I know Food Banks Canada's, for the first time ever, Food Banks Canada's hunger count showed that there's no longer a majority of people accessing food banks who are unemployed. We're now getting to parity with people who are employed accessing food banks in Canada, right? So we're seeing that evidence. So basic income is not just about poverty reduction. Absolutely, the people who would be benefit the most of a guaranteed livable income are the people with the lowest incomes. But it provides security for people at all across the spectrum. Talk about seniors who maybe are only getting a pension of $22,000 a year. A well-designed basic income can interact with that and provide top-up to that, right? You have then you have yes, seniors are definitely a priority right now, but we have generations now that have no form of retirement savings or pensions, right? And increasingly, right? Me included, right? We're working in sectors that we don't have pensions. What are we going to do when we retire? We're also not making the incomes we need to save the way that our parents were able to, right? And work is more and more precarious for young people. The gig economies, consulting work, those types of things. Wages are no longer, employment is no longer necessarily the pathway to poverty for everybody, right? Or necessarily the pathway to security. It's not just about poverty, it's about the pathway to income security, right? So we have less and less benefits in our jobs. We have we don't have any retirement savings. So a basic income can top up people's incomes to allow them to be more stable. Increasing food prices. I know my household, our grocery bill, I've got 2 kids and my wife and a dog that eats way more food than he should because he's massive. Our bill has gone up at least $200 or $300 a month. We're fortunate that we have income that can at least support that, but we've had to make choices just like everyone else. And many people in our neighborhood, in our communities, who normally wouldn't have to think about these things are now thinking about these things. So basic income can't just be about poverty reduction. That's a key part of it. But you're never going to get a basic income we want or that we actually need if it's just about poverty reduction. If it's just about poverty reduction, then I would agree with groups like the group in BC that we just need to tweak targeted services and programs. Right? We may as well just spend our time and resources on tweaking existing programs and services, increasing social assistance rates. The examples you had from Newfoundland where you saw food security insecurity go down because you change that's the work we should do if it's just about poverty, but it's not. And when I get to the discussion in a bit about what the future of food charity is, I think it'll make a little more sense why that's important. But these things are obvious. This covers the income part of the equation of food security. You give a predictable, sustainable, and form of income security to people with a basic income, with less bureaucracy around it. That's got to be a key part of it. Basic income is not just about more money for people, because it is about more money, increasing social assistance and things. It's also about reducing the bureaucracy around service and access. There's a report that I always refer to in Ontario, even though it's about probably 14 years old now, by a colleague of mine, John Stapleton, called Why Is It So Tough to Get Ahead? And he looked at the more than 160 rules in Ontario's social assistance system that, 1, are confusing, 2, create barriers to access, and 3, don't even make sense when you put them beside each other. Right? The rules around how student loans for a young person in the house can actually reduce the social assistance of the parent in the house. Even though the kid is going to school and that money is meant to support their education, the government of Ontario rules can consider it income into the household. Right? Like that's just one example, and I'm sure across provinces we could find the same things, right? So we've got this rules-based system that is, and my colleague Liam at UBI Works really talks about this a lot. It's a rules-based system that is meant to appeal to the majority of people, right? It's meant to appease the majority of people. It's not meant to actually design a system that's properly designed for people. It's meant to appease all the voices of opposition rather than to provide support. So you create a rules-based system that can basically counter any opposition somebody has. And that's what we've done with social assistance. Every time somebody has a challenge, or a concern, we create a new rule to make sure that we're not people aren't taking advantage. You all work in food charity. How many people do you think are actually taking advantage of what you do? Right? I think the data shows us around dignity and around the fact that most people who are food insecure aren't accessing food banks, that it's not about people taking advantage. Right? And the one thing I always say to my staff, if somebody shows up at the door and they really don't need a food bank, there's probably something else wrong, and you should probably just serve them. Right? Give them food. Our job is to give food to people and let them decide what they do with the support we give them. Right? That's our role. And I think we need to think about a basic income in the same way. Let's create a system where we trust each other. And we trust because when you build, we see this in the business world. The #1 recommendation that business leaders tell each other is you need to build a corporation based on trust. Trust first, right? But we don't do that when it comes to our social services. We don't do that when it comes to the way we engage and support our fellow Canadians. Basic income can do that. It's about trust. And then you have checks and balances, right? You have a tax system, right? We saw this with the CERB. People were concerned about it. Well, there was a tax system in place to capture anything that people shouldn't have got. Yeah, there might have been challenges with how they went about it, but the system was built, if it had been thought through and not implemented so quickly, you could have created a proper system that allowed to claw back anything that somebody didn't need, right? And that's what it should be based on, whether they need it, not whether they deserve it. And that's where basic income comes in. And we know that a national basic income can lift people out of poverty. An analysis from CANCIA, the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis, that UBI Works commissioned, showed this, that we could lift millions of Canadians out of poverty, and we could increase the incomes of the lowest by as much as 3 times. And recent analysis from Stats Canada on their disaggregated data on poverty shows that poverty dropped in Canada from between 2015 and 2020 from 8.1% from 14.5%, and they argue that it was largely driven by changes to the Canada Child Benefit and COVID and pandemic benefits. That actually the #1 drivers of poverty reduction, similar to what Dr. Tarasek showed in Newfoundland, were driven by government policy change and income security programming, right? So we know it can work, and we know it will do this. And it promotes dignified access to food based on personal need and choice, right? You talked a lot in your presentation about what people may want and see. This provides a way for people to have the choice that they need outside of the models that we could design for them. It provides them with the absolute choice. We've seen this in the rise of gift cards in our work, right? It's about giving people choice and ease of access. A basic income is not really any different when you think about it. It provides choice and ease of access and allows people to get the food they need when they want it. Okay? The last sort of part I want to talk about a bit is what does this mean for food charity? I have a bit of a confusing background because I work in food security and frontline food banking. I'm also a big supporter of basic income. I will also tell you, if you see the basic income is not the ultimate answer either, right? So because I believe this work is complicated. It's the answer now, but it's the next answer, right? So food charity is the wrong response to food insecurity. Yes, we agree, it is. Donated food and getting it to people is not going to, it doesn't solve food insecurity, it gives them food today. Is it necessary? Yes, right now it is. We can't let people go hungry while we have these discussions. We just can't. We're not necessarily addressing the entire problem, so we need to work on that. What can we do to grow the work that we do to support others in our community that may not be accessing our programs? And the data that we just saw demonstrates that we need to do that. Most people who are food insecure in any way are not accessing our programs. Okay, what do we do about that? That's actually become a key strategy question for Feed the Need. Our board and myself decided that we know that we're serving the 25,000 most food insecure people a year in Durham region. But we also know that there's another 25,000 people in the other level areas of the food insecurity spectrum that we're not serving. So a big strategy for us between now and 2025 is to build out new types of programming that can help us reach other people. The work of Community Food Centres Canada is a big inspiration for some of that because they're doing interesting things that are not just about people who are the most food insecure. There's ways of building community food insecurity. And I think that is sort of the vision for where we need to go. We need to stop charity to me is a legal definition. We need to be more thinking about community food programs. What does it mean to build community food programs that build communities around food? That provide, in my community, I've got amazing agricultural communities around me. What can I do to make sure that some of that food is going to the lowest income neighborhoods in the south end of Oshawa, where our organization is based, right? There's lots of amazing work going on in our community. The other institution in our community is Durham College. They've got a center for food at Durham College. They teach everything from culinary all the way to horticulture. They grow things. They build community gardens. They build urban gardens. Some of their graduates have gone out and started farms in my hometown of Bowmanville, where they're growing for communities and they're creating new types of food programs that are innovative. How do we do that work and get food to the people who need it in our communities? What can we do to reimagine what food organizations are? Right? Yeah, food banking is part of it, and if you look at a lot of the community food center models out there, they do have a component that is still traditional food banking, but they build on top of it. And there's other examples out there. Community gardens are a big one. We work with community gardens in our community, and not just, we don't take the food they grow, we build connections in the neighborhoods they're in and allow people to get the food from those sources. Right? It's all about bringing food into our organizations. So we need to think differently. The challenge, and this is where my, the confusing part I think for some is, but a basic income is not the ultimate solution. It's an immediate solution that creates more dignified access today. But the problems with food insecurity are actually driven by a global market-based system. Right? The rise in food prices is not going to be solved by a basic income. You have to keep raising your basic income. The rise in food prices is caused by a global food system that is market-driven. Right? And a basic income is actually a response to a market-driven system. It puts money in people's hands. So we need to be thinking in new ways, and we know this is coming out a lot from the climate movement. We need to be thinking differently about how we build our communities and how we build our agriculture and how we build our access to food. The next stage of work that we're talking about at UBI Works actually, and we've started this sort of organization or a project called Commonwealth Canada, is we're looking at our Commonwealth. And the interesting thing, this actually ties right back to people like Guy Standing, who is a founder of the basic income movement globally, but is also a big advocate of the commons. Talking about our common lands, our access to common resources. What do we have as a country that belongs to us all? We've got great examples in Canada of this, right? This is how we treat our fisheries. We've always treated them this way in many ways. This is how we've treated forestry resources. This is how we treat oil. We collect royalties and we collect rent payments from the companies that extract these resources, which is great. They go into public revenue, right? We have this idea in Canada. What we've lost a lot, though, is that the food is part of our commons. And there's a growing movement around thinking about our food resources as a collective resource. Human civilizations were built, and I'm an anthropologist originally by training. Civilizations were built around the need to grow collectively, right? The first cities were built around the need to grow food collectively. Right? We've lost that in our history. It's still part of who we are. How can we bring that into a modern context? And I don't have the answer on this. This is just where the thought is going in some of this work, is how can we start thinking about food as this common resource instead of a market commodity? How can we do that more? And what would that actually imply for food security? And what would that actually imply for food charity and food organizations? So could we think of things differently? Can we think of our roles differently in our community? As we address the income security needs of the people we serve, how do we build different types of programming that reach more people? You know, the gap in Dr. Tarasek's graph, where we're serving this many people, but the food security needs are 20 times higher. How do we get to those people that we're not serving? How do we build programming that actually responds to community food insecurity versus individual food insecurity? So that's where I think we need to be talking and thinking. Again, I don't have the answers to it yet. It's a new conversation, but I think it's worth introducing, and I think it's worth thinking about. And I think that is it. Oh. Those were very big. They shouldn't be that big. But anyway.
We'll make sure.
So that's the, I'll leave it there.
Just one.